The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly as Lillian Montgomery clutched her handkerchief against her mouth, her eyes stinging with sand and desperation. She had been a fool to think she could make this journey alone, and now she would pay for that foolishness with her life. The year was 1885, and Lillian had left behind everything she knew in Boston to answer an advertisement for a schoolteacher position in the growing town of Redemption, Arizona Territory. At 22, she had grown tired of the suffocating expectations of her family and the stuffy potential suitors her mother constantly paraded before her. The West represented freedom, purpose, and a chance to build something of her own. But the stagecoach had been ambushed 2 days prior, the driver killed, and the other passengers, 2 elderly gentlemen headed to California, had perished when the coach overturned. By some miracle, Lillian had survived with only minor injuries, but now she wandered aimlessly. Her water gone since yesterday morning, her elegant traveling dress torn and filthy, her once pinned chestnut hair now hanging in wild tangles around her dust-streaked face. The wind had begun to pick up an hour ago, and with it came the sand. At first, it was merely unpleasant, but now it had become a howling monster, whipping around her with increasing fury. Visibility had dropped to mere feet in front of her, and Lillian could no longer tell which direction she was heading. Each step became more difficult than the last as the sand piled against her skirts and boots. "Help!" she cried, but her voice was swallowed by the roaring wind. "Is anyone there?" Please, her strength was failing. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her throat raw from thirst. She stumbled, fell to her knees, and wondered if this barren, unforgiving land would be her final resting place, her bones eventually bleached by the same sun that now tormented her. As consciousness began to slip away, Lillian thought she heard the pounding of hooves. A hallucination, surely her mind's final comfort before death claimed her. Then, through the swirling wall of sand, a dark shape emerged. A horse. A rider. A man's voice called out, though she could barely hear it above the storm. Strong hands gripped her shoulders, and Lillian looked up into the most startlingly blue eyes she had ever seen, partially hidden beneath the brim of a dust-covered hat. "Madam, can you stand?" the man shouted over the wind. Lillian tried to respond, but no words came. Her legs wouldn't support her weight. The stranger seemed to understand immediately. He dismounted in one fluid motion and crouched beside her, his face now level with hers. "I'm going to get you out of here," he said firmly, his voice somehow both gentle and commanding. "Hold on to me." He took her hand in his, the calloused warmth of his palm engulfing her smaller fingers. With his other arm, he supported her waist and helped her to her feet. The simple touch of human contact after her days alone nearly broke her composure, and Lillian fought back tears. "My horse is just there," he said, guiding her forward. "We need to move quickly. This storm's getting worse." Lillian stumbled alongside him, her hand clutching his like a lifeline. His grip was firm, reassuring, as he led her through the blinding sand toward the silhouette of his waiting horse. "I'm going to lift you up first," he explained, releasing her hand only to place both of his at her waist. Before she could respond, he had hoisted her onto the saddle with surprising ease. The man swung up behind her in one smooth movement, his arms coming around her as he took the reins. Lillian felt herself leaning back against his chest, too exhausted to maintain her own posture. "I've got you," he said, his breath warm against her ear. "Just hold on." As the horse began to move beneath them, Lillian felt the stranger's arm tighten around her waist, keeping her secure. She couldn't see where they were going, could barely keep her eyes open against the stinging sand, but something in his confident handling of the horse told her he knew exactly where to go. "What's your name, madam?" he asked, his voice raised to be heard over the howling wind. "Lillian," she managed to croak, her throat painfully dry. "Lillian Montgomery, Miss Montgomery, I'm Garrett Wade. We've got about 3 miles to my cabin. Think you can stay awake that long? I'll try," she whispered, though she wasn't sure he could hear her. Garrett's arm tightened slightly around her waist. "Just lean on me if you need to. I won't let you fall." The journey passed in a blur of wind, sand, and the steady rhythm of the horse beneath them. True to his word, Garrett kept her securely in the saddle, his body a shield against the worst of the storm. Lillian drifted in and out of awareness, each time returning to the sensation of his solid presence behind her, his hand firmly holding hers when she began to slip sideways. After what seemed like hours, the wind began to diminish, and Lillian could make out the shadowy outline of a small cabin nestled against a rocky outcropping. A corral stood nearby, and what appeared to be a small barn or storage shed. "Here we are," Garrett said, bringing the horse to a stop. "My place isn't much, but it's solid and the storm won't reach us here." He dismounted first, then reached up to help her down. Lillian's legs buckled as soon as her feet touched the ground, and Garrett caught her effortlessly, sweeping her into his arms. "I can walk," she protested weakly. "No need," he replied, already carrying her toward the cabin door. "You've been through enough today." The interior of the cabin was simple but neat. A stone fireplace dominated one wall with a small wooden table and 2 chairs nearby. A narrow bed stood in one corner, covered with a patchwork quilt. Shelves held books, tins, and other supplies. It was humble but undeniably homey. Garrett set her gently on one of the chairs. "Stay put. I need to get Valor into the barn, then I'll be right back." Lillian nodded, too exhausted to do anything else. When the door closed behind him, she took a deeper look at her surroundings. Despite the rustic nature of the cabin, everything was organized and clean. A man who valued order then. On the wall hung a rifle and what appeared to be military insignia of some kind. Minutes later, Garrett returned, shaking sand from his hat and coat before hanging them on pegs by the door. With his hat removed, Lillian could see him clearly for the first time. He was taller than she'd realized, with broad shoulders and a lean, muscular build. His face was tanned and weathered from the sun, with lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled often, though he wasn't smiling now. His hair was dark brown, almost black, worn longer than was fashionable back east but not unkempt. He appeared to be in his early 30s, though the rugged life out here aged men quickly. "First things first," he said, moving to a water barrel in the corner. He filled a tin cup and brought it to her. "Small sips only, too much at once will make you sick." Lillian's hands trembled as she took the cup, and Garrett steadied them with his own until she had a firm grip. The water was cool and felt like heaven on her parched throat. She wanted desperately to gulp it down but followed his instructions, taking tiny sips. "Thank you," she managed after a moment. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found me." Garrett's expression was grave as he crouched beside her chair. "What were you doing out there alone, Miss Montgomery? These lands aren't forgiving to those who don't know them." Lillian explained about the stagecoach, the ambush, and her desperate attempt to find help or civilization. "Redemption is nearly 30 miles southeast of here," Garrett told her, shaking his head. "You were heading in the completely wrong direction, another day out there." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "The stage wasn't due in Redemption until tomorrow," she said. "No one will even know to look for me yet." Garrett stood and moved to the fireplace, adding wood from a nearby stack and stirring the embers to life. "The sandstorm will last through the night. First thing tomorrow, I'll ride to Redemption and let them know you're safe. For now, you need rest and food." As Garrett prepared a simple meal of beans, dried beef, and biscuits, Lillian became increasingly aware of her disheveled appearance. Her once fine traveling dress was torn in several places, her hair a tangled mess, her face and hands filthy with sand and dust. She must look a fright. "Is there somewhere I might freshen up a bit?" she asked hesitantly. Garrett nodded toward a screen in the corner. "There's a washing bowl and pitcher behind there. I'll heat some water for you." While the water heated, Lillian attempted to tidy her hair with her fingers, wincing as they caught in the knots and tangles. "Here," Garrett said, handing her a steaming basin of water. "Take your time, dinner won't be ready for a while yet." Behind the screen, Lillian gratefully washed her face and hands, using a small square of soap that smelled faintly of pine. She did her best to smooth her hair and pin it back up, though without a brush or mirror, the results were far from her usual standards. Still, she felt more human by the time she emerged. Garrett had set the small table with 2 tin plates and cups. The simple meal smelled wonderful to her empty stomach. As they ate, Lillian studied her rescuer surreptitiously. There was a quiet confidence about him, a self-sufficiency that spoke of years spent relying on his own resources. "Have you lived out here long, Mr. Wade?" she asked. "5 years at this cabin," he replied. "Been in the territory nearly 10, and before that, a shadow crossed his face. I was a scout for the Army, 7th Cavalry." The silence that followed told Lillian this was not a subject to pursue. Instead, she asked, "What do you do now?" "Raise horses mostly, break and train them for ranchers and the Army." He took a sip of coffee. "What about you?" "Teaching school in Redemption," Lillian nodded. "I answered an advertisement. The town council wrote that they're growing rapidly and need a proper school. They've built a schoolhouse and assembled books, but they need someone to teach the children." "Redemption's changed a lot in recent years," Garrett said. "When I first came through, it was little more than a watering hole with a saloon. Now there's a church, general store, even talk of a railroad spur line eventually." After dinner, exhaustion hit Lillian like a physical force. She swayed slightly in her chair, and Garrett immediately noticed. "You need sleep," he said, rising. "Take the bed, I'll use my bedroll by the fire." Lillian began to protest, but Garrett held up a hand to stop her. "No arguments, Miss Montgomery. You've been through an ordeal. The bed's yours." Too tired to argue further, Lillian gratefully accepted his offer. As she settled beneath the patchwork quilt, the sound of the sandstorm still howling outside, she watched Garrett prepare his bedroll near the hearth. "Mr. Wade," she said softly, "thank you. Not just for the rescue, but for your kindness afterward." He looked up, and for the first time a small smile touched his lips. "Get some rest, Miss Montgomery. You're safe now." As sleep claimed her, Lillian's last thought was of those startling blue eyes and the strength of his hand holding hers through the storm. Lillian woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of quiet movement. For a moment she was disoriented, the unfamiliar surroundings confusing her still groggy mind. Then the events of the previous day rushed back: the sandstorm, her rescue, the stranger who had saved her life. Garrett Wade stood at the small stove, his back to her as he tended to something in a pan. Morning light filtered through the cabin's single window, indicating the storm had passed. Lillian sat up slowly, wincing at the stiffness in her muscles. "Good morning," Garrett said without turning. "How are you feeling?" "Better, thank you," she replied, smoothing her hair self-consciously. "Though rather sore." "Not surprising. You walked a long way before I found you." He turned then, a plate in his hand. Hungry, the simple breakfast of fried potatoes and salt pork was possibly the most delicious meal Lillian had ever tasted. Or perhaps it was just the relief of being alive to eat it. As they ate, Garrett outlined his plan. "I'll ride to Redemption today, let them know you're safe. The stagecoach driver who was scheduled to bring you in will be worried when you don't arrive. Will you tell them about the ambush? Those poor men who died?" Garrett nodded gravely. "I'll speak to Sheriff Hollister. He'll organize a party to recover the bodies and investigate. Do you remember where it happened?" Lillian described the location as best she could, mentioning a distinctive rock formation that had been visible from the road. Garrett seemed to recognize it from her description. "That's about 15 miles from here," he said. "Probably Comanchero raiders. They've been causing trouble along that route for months." After breakfast, Garrett brought her a basin of fresh water and, to her surprise, a hairbrush. "It was my mother's," he explained, seeming almost embarrassed. "I kept it. Well, never had the heart to get rid of it." Lillian accepted the brush gratefully. "I'll take good care of it." While Garrett prepared for his ride to town, Lillian made use of the brush, working through the tangles in her hair until it hung smooth and shining down her back. It was a small thing, but it made her feel more like herself again. When she emerged from behind the privacy screen, Garrett was by the door, buckling on a gun belt. He glanced up, and for a moment he simply stared. Lillian felt her cheeks warm under his gaze. "I'll be back by nightfall," he said finally, clearing his throat. "There's food on the shelf there and plenty of water. Keep the door barred while I'm gone." "I will," she promised. "Be careful." Garrett paused with his hand on the door. "Miss Montgomery, I don't mean to alarm you, but there's a rifle above the fireplace. Do you know how to use it?" Lillian's eyes widened. No, I've never handled a firearm. He seemed to consider this information. The chances of anyone coming by are slim, but if they do, stay inside and don't open the door unless you're absolutely certain they mean no harm. With that sobering advice, he departed, leaving Lillian alone in the cabin. Through the window, she watched him mount his horse, a magnificent black stallion she now knew was named Valor, and ride away, his figure soon becoming a small dot on the horizon. The day stretched long before her. To occupy herself, Lillian explored the cabin more thoroughly. The bookshelves held an eclectic collection: military histories, a few dog-eared novels, practical manuals on horsemanship and wilderness survival, and, surprisingly, a volume of poetry by Wordsworth. She ran her fingers along the spine of the poetry book, wondering about the man who owned it. On a small shelf near the bed sat a framed daguerreotype of a young woman with Garrett's same striking blue eyes. His mother, perhaps. Next to it was a small wooden box intricately carved. Curiosity tugged at her, but Lillian resisted the urge to open it. She had already intruded enough on his private space. To make herself useful, Lillian tidied the cabin, washed the breakfast dishes, and even managed to mend a tear in her dress using a small sewing kit she found in a drawer. By mid-afternoon, she had exhausted her activities and found herself standing at the window, gazing out at the vast, empty landscape. The isolation of Garrett's existence struck her forcefully. His nearest neighbor must be miles away, the town even further. What would drive a man to choose such solitude? The military insignia, the shadowed look that had crossed his face when she asked about his past, these hinted at stories he kept carefully buried. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Lillian felt a growing unease. Garrett had said he would return by nightfall. She peered anxiously out the window, searching for any sign of a rider, but saw only the empty, golden plains stretching to distant mountains. Just as she was beginning to truly worry, a movement in the distance caught her eye. A cloud of dust, then the distinctive shape of a rider. Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by surprise at the strength of that relief. She had known Garrett Wade for barely a day, yet the thought of him not returning had filled her with genuine dread. As he drew closer, Lillian could see he wasn't alone. Behind his horse trailed a pack-horse loaded with supplies. She unbarred the door and stepped onto the small porch as he approached. Garrett dismounted, leading both horses toward the corral. "Everything all right here?" he called. "Yes, perfectly fine," she replied. "How was your journey?" "Productive." He began unloading packages from the packhorse. "Sheriff Hollister's organizing a party to investigate the attack and recover the bodies. They'll head out at first light tomorrow." Lillian moved to help him with the packages. "And what of redemption? Did you speak with the town council about my situation?" Garrett nodded, handing her a parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Mayor Franklin sends his regards and his relief that you survived. The town's been preparing for your arrival. They're quite excited about their new schoolteacher." "When will I be able to go there?" Lillian asked, following him into the cabin with the package. Garrett set down the supplies he was carrying and turned to face her. "That's something we need to discuss. The sheriff thinks it best if you remain here for a week or so, until they've dealt with the Comancheros. The route to town isn't safe right now." Lillian's heart sank. While Garrett had been nothing but kind, the prospect of imposing on him for days or even weeks was mortifying. "I cannot possibly intrude on your hospitality for so long." "It's no intrusion," he said firmly. "Besides, it's the safest option. Once the sheriff's confident the road is secure, I'll take you to redemption myself." Seeing she had little choice, Lillian nodded reluctantly. "Thank you, I'll try not to be a burden." "You won't be." He gestured to the parcel in her hands. "That's for you, by the way, from Mrs. Franklin, the mayor's wife. She thought you might need some feminine necessities." Lillian felt her cheeks color slightly as she accepted the package. Opening it, she found a simple but clean cotton dress, undergarments, a nightgown, and various toiletries. The thoughtfulness of this unknown woman brought tears to her eyes. "Please convey my deepest thanks to Mrs. Franklin when next you see her," Lillian said softly. "You can thank her yourself once you're settled in town." Garrett continued unpacking the supplies: flour, coffee, sugar, bacon, and other staples. I also brought some paper and pencils. Thought you might like to prepare for your teaching duties while you're here. The consideration of the gesture touched Lillian deeply. That was very thoughtful, Mr. Wade, Garrett, he said, glancing up from his task. If we're to share this cabin for a week or more, you might as well use my given name. Garrett, she repeated, testing the name, and you must call me Lillian. That evening, as they shared another simple but satisfying meal, Lillian found herself studying Garrett with renewed interest. Away from the immediate crisis of her rescue, she noticed different things about him: the careful precision with which he moved, the quiet competence in everything he did, the way his eyes sometimes seemed to look beyond the cabin walls to something only he could see. You mentioned you raise horses, she said, breaking a comfortable silence. I saw several in the corral when you rode in. Garrett nodded. I've got 8 right now: 3 mares, a stallion, 2 yearlings, and 2 I'm training for the army. Is that what took you to war originally? Your knowledge of horses? He looked up, surprise flickering across his features. How did you know I fought in the war? The insignia on your wall, Lillian explained. And there's something in the way you carry yourself. My father and brothers served in the Union Army. Garrett was quiet for a moment. I enlisted in '62, served with the 2nd Kansas Cavalry. His voice was matter-of-fact, but Lillian sensed memories churning beneath the surface. My brother James never quite came back from the war, she said softly. Not completely. He's there physically, but part of him seems forever lost on those battlefields. Something shifted in Garrett's expression, a flash of recognition, of shared understanding. War changes a man, he said simply. Lillian didn't press further. Instead, she asked about his horses, and Garrett's entire demeanor transformed as he spoke of them: his pride in the bloodlines he was developing, his methods of training, his hopes for building a reputation that would bring buyers from across the territory. Would you show me tomorrow? She asked when he finally paused. Your horses, I mean, I'd like to see them. Garrett seemed pleased by her interest. Of course. The yearlings are especially fine, good bone structure, intelligent eyes. They'll make excellent cavalry mounts with the right training. Later, as they prepared for sleep, Lillian once again taking the bed despite her protests, Garrett on his bedroll near the fire, she found herself reluctant for the day to end. There was something comforting about his presence, this man who had appeared like a guardian angel in her darkest hour. Garrett, she said softly as he banked the fire for the night, I've been thinking about what happened if you hadn't found me when you did. But I did, he interrupted gently. No need to dwell on what might have been. How did you find me? In that blinding storm, what made you ride out? Garrett was silent for a long moment, and Lillian thought he might not answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice low in the dimly lit cabin. I was checking the perimeter of my property before the storm hit, saw buzzards circling to the north. Went to investigate and found the remains of your stagecoach. His eyes met hers across the darkening room. There were tracks leading away from its small boot prints. I followed them until the wind started covering them up. By then, the storm was getting bad, but I couldn't just leave knowing someone might be out there. You risked your life for a stranger, Lillian said, wonder in her voice. Garrett shrugged as though his actions had been ordinary, expected. Anyone would have done the same. But they both knew that wasn't true. In this harsh land, survival often depended on looking after oneself first. Garrett's decision to ride into a sandstorm on the slim chance of finding a survivor spoke volumes about his character. Well, I'm grateful beyond words that you did, Lillian said. Good night, Garrett. Good night, Lillian, he replied, and something in the way he said her name made her heart beat a little faster as she drifted toward sleep. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having cleared the air of dust and leaving behind a sky of startling blue. After breakfast, true to his word, Garrett took Lillian to see his horses. Dressed in Mrs. Franklin's borrowed gown, a simple blue cotton that was a better fit for the frontier than Lillian's own damaged traveling dress, she followed Garrett to the corral. Inside, the horses moved with grace and power, their coats gleaming in the morning sun. They're beautiful, Lillian breathed. Leaning on the rough wooden fence, Garrett clicked his tongue and a chestnut mare approached, her liquid brown eyes curious. "This is Penny," he said, reaching out to stroke the horse's velvety nose. "She's the matriarch of my little herd, 15 years old and still the smartest horse I've ever known." The mare nuzzled Garrett's hand affectionately, and Lillian was struck by the tenderness in his expression as he interacted with the animal. "Would you like to pet her?" he asked, noticing Lillian's fascinated gaze. "May I? I've never been this close to a horse before, not really." "In Boston, we only saw them pulling carriages or with riders already mounted." Garrett looked surprised. "Never. Well, Penny's gentle as they come. Here." He took Lillian's hand, that same warm, steadying grip she remembered from the storm, and guided it to the mare's nose. The horse's skin was softer than she had imagined, warm and alive beneath her fingertips. "Oh," Lillian exclaimed with delight as Penny snuffled at her palm. "She's wonderful." "She likes you," Garrett observed, something like approval in his voice. "Penny's an excellent judge of character." They spent the morning with the horses, Garrett patiently explaining the finer points of equine care and behavior. Lillian absorbed every word, fascinated not just by the information but by the transformation in Garrett himself. Among his horses, the reserve that normally cloaked him fell away, revealing a passionate, articulate man who clearly loved his work. Over the next several days, a routine developed between them. Mornings were spent with the horses, Garrett continuing Lillian's education in all things equine. She proved an eager student, quickly moving from nervous petting to confidently offering feed and even helping groom the gentler animals. Afternoons, Lillian would prepare lesson plans for her future students, while Garrett worked on training the young horses or making repairs around his property. In the evenings, they would share dinner and conversation that grew increasingly comfortable and wide-ranging. Lillian learned that Garrett had come west after the war, unable to settle back into civilian life in his native Missouri. He had worked as an Army scout, then as a ranch hand, saving every penny until he could buy this small plot of land and begin breeding horses. His dream was to build a reputation as a breeder of quality cavalry mounts and eventually expand his operation. In turn, Lillian told him about her life in Boston, her desire to escape the confines of society there, and her hope to make a real difference in the lives of the children she would teach. "My mother was scandalized when I announced I was coming west," she admitted one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. "She had plans for me to marry the son of one of my father's business associates, a perfectly respectable young man with excellent prospects, and absolutely no imagination or passion for anything beyond his ledger books." Garrett's mouth quirked in a small smile. "And you preferred adventure to security." "I preferred meaning," Lillian replied thoughtfully. "I wanted my life to matter, to contribute something worthwhile. Teaching children who might otherwise go without an education seemed more valuable than presiding over Boston tea parties for the next 50 years. Your students in redemption will be fortunate to have someone who cares so deeply," Garrett said. The genuine respect in his voice warmed Lillian more than she cared to admit. Over the days they had spent together, she had grown increasingly aware of Garrett as more than just her rescuer. His quiet strength, his kindness, his intelligence all combined to create a man unlike any she had known before. On the 5th day of her stay, Garrett received a visitor, a grizzled old prospector named Hank, who occasionally brought supplies from town in exchange for Garrett shoeing his mule. The old man's eyes widened considerably when he saw Lillian, and she could practically see the questions forming. Garrett explained the situation briefly, emphasizing that Lillian would be continuing to redemption as soon as the sheriff deemed the road safe. "Heard about that stagecoach attack," Hank said, shaking his head sadly. "Sheriff and his boys caught up with them Comancheros yesterday. There was a fight, 2 of the bandits killed, rest scattered. Word is the road should be clear now." The news brought Lillian both relief and, surprisingly, a touch of dismay. Her time at Garrett's cabin would soon come to an end. The realization that she would miss this place miss him caught her off guard. After Hank departed, Garrett turned to Lillian. "If the road's safe, I can take you to Redemption tomorrow. The town's eager to meet their new teacher." "Oh," Lillian said, unable to hide her mixed emotions. "That's wonderful news, of course." Garrett studied her face. "Unless you'd prefer to wait another day or two to be certain." Was that hope she heard in his voice? Lillian couldn't be sure, and she dared not assume. "I've imposed on your hospitality long enough," she said finally. "Tomorrow would be fine." That evening, a strange tension hung in the air between them. Their usual easy conversation faltered, replaced by long silences and careful politeness. As Lillian prepared for her last night in Garrett's cabin, she felt an overwhelming urge to say something, to acknowledge the connection that had grown between them, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she busied herself gathering her few belongings, her mended traveling dress, the supplies Mrs. Franklin had sent, the lesson plans she had carefully crafted. When she finished, the small bundle seemed a poor representation of the time she had spent here. "Lillian," Garrett said suddenly from across the room, "I've been thinking." Her heart quickened at something in his tone. "Yes, Redemption's only about 3 hours' ride from here. I could. That is, if you wanted, I could visit sometimes to see how you're settling in." Lillian felt a smile bloom across her face. "I would like that very much." Relief visibly washed over Garrett's features. "Good, that's good." It wasn't a declaration of feelings, but it was an acknowledgement of something neither of them had been ready to name, a desire to continue whatever had begun in these few days together. The next morning, they set out for Redemption just after sunrise. Garrett had insisted Lillian ride Penny, saying the gentle mare would give her the smoothest journey. He rode Valor alongside, leading a packhorse carrying Lillian's belongings and supplies he needed to trade in town. As they rode, Garrett pointed out landmarks and features of the landscape, teaching Lillian to read the territory as he did. She absorbed his lessons eagerly, asking questions and committing his answers to memory. "There's Redemption," Garrett said finally, pointing to a cluster of buildings in the distance, nestled in a shallow valley. "Not much to look at, but it's growing fast." As they drew closer, Lillian could make out a main street lined with wooden buildings, including a church with a small steeple. On the outskirts stood newer structures, evidence of the town's expansion. Their arrival caused something of a stir. People emerged from shops and homes to watch as they rode down the main street toward a 2-story building with a sign proclaiming it the Redemption Hotel and Dining Hall. A portly, balding man in a well-worn suit hurried out to meet them. "Miss Montgomery, I presume? I'm Mayor Franklin. We've been so worried about you." Garrett helped Lillian dismount, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary. The contact sent a flutter through her stomach that had nothing to do with nervousness about meeting the townspeople. "Mr. Wade explained your harrowing experience," the mayor continued, pumping Lillian's hand enthusiastically. "Thank the Lord he found you when he did. The whole town's been praying for your safe arrival." A crowd had gathered, and Lillian found herself surrounded by curious, friendly faces as Mayor Franklin made introductions. Mrs. Franklin, a plump, motherly woman with kind eyes, pushed through to embrace Lillian warmly. "You poor dear. What an ordeal you've endured. Come along now, we've prepared a room for you at the hotel, and you must be exhausted from your journey." As Mrs. Franklin began to usher her toward the hotel, Lillian looked back at Garrett, who stood holding the horse's reins, watching her with an unreadable expression. "Wait," Lillian said to Mrs. Franklin. "I need a moment." She hurried back to Garrett. "Will you be staying in town tonight?" He shook his head. "Need to get back to the horses, but I'll return next week with some colts I'm delivering to the livery." Lillian felt disappointment wash over her, even as she understood his responsibilities. "Thank you again for everything." Garrett's eyes softened as he looked down at her. "You'll do well here, Lillian. These are good people." She wanted to say so much more, but the crowd of onlookers made such a conversation impossible. Instead, she simply squeezed his hand briefly before turning to follow Mrs. Franklin. As she reached the hotel steps, Lillian glanced back one last time to see Garrett mounting Valor. He tipped his hat to her, then turned the horse and rode out of town, his straight-backed figure gradually becoming smaller in the distance. Watching him go, Lillian felt a curious mixture of sadness and anticipation. Their paths had crossed by chance in a howling sandstorm, but something told her their story was far from over. The next week passed in a whirlwind of activity as Lillian settled into her new role in redemption. The townspeople welcomed her with genuine warmth, eager to show off their growing community and particularly proud of the schoolhouse they had built. The building was simple but solidly constructed, with large windows to provide plenty of light, rows of desks for the students, and a small living space at the back that would serve as Lillian's quarters once she moved out of the hotel. 27 children enrolled so far, Mayor Franklin told her proudly as he showed her around. Ages 6 to 16, some have had a bit of schooling before, others none at all. They're a mixed bunch: ranchers' children, shopkeepers' kids, even a few from mining families who have settled nearby. Lillian's heart swelled with purpose as she surveyed the classroom. This was exactly what she had hoped for, a place where she could make a real difference. Yet as she organized books and prepared lessons, her thoughts often drifted to Garrett and his quiet cabin on the outskirts of civilization. She had begun to wonder if perhaps she had imagined the connection between them when, true to his word, Garrett rode into town exactly 1 week after leaving her there. Lillian was in the schoolhouse arranging primers when Mrs. Franklin burst in, eyes twinkling. "That handsome Mr. Wade is at the livery with some horses," she announced with barely concealed delight. "I thought you might want to know." Lillian felt her cheeks warm at the woman's obvious matchmaking, but she couldn't deny the leap of excitement in her chest. "Thank you, Mrs. Franklin. I should probably thank him again for his assistance." The older woman's knowing smile followed Lillian as she hurried from the schoolhouse, trying not to appear too eager as she made her way to the livery stable at the edge of town. She found Garrett in conversation with the livery owner, discussing the merits of the 2 young horses he had brought. He hadn't seen her yet, and Lillian took a moment to simply watch him, the confident set of his shoulders, the animated way he spoke about his horses, the respect with which the other man listened to him. When he finally turned and caught sight of her, the smile that transformed his face sent a rush of warmth through Lillian's entire body. "Miss Montgomery," he said, excusing himself from the liveryman and walking toward her. "How are you finding redemption?" "Very welcoming," she replied, suddenly aware of her rapid heartbeat. "Everyone has been most kind. The schoolhouse meets your expectations. It's wonderful. Classes begin on Monday. I have the weekend to make final preparations." They stood looking at each other, a foot of empty space between them that somehow seemed both too much and too little. "I was just about to have lunch at the hotel," Lillian said finally. "Would you care to join me? I'd love to hear how Penny and the others are doing." Garrett accepted readily, and they walked together down the main street, drawing curious glances from townspeople who had witnessed Lillian's dramatic arrival the week before. At the hotel dining room, they were shown to a small table near the window. Once they had ordered, a comfortable familiarity returned to their conversation, as though they were back at Garrett's cabin sharing the evening meal. "The yearlings have been testing the fence line," Garrett told her, amusement in his voice. "Penny keeps them in line, though. I swear that mare thinks she's their mother, not just another horse in the corral." Lillian laughed, picturing the gentle mare herding the younger horses. "I miss her, all of them, actually." She hesitated, then added softly, "and the cabin." Garrett's eyes darkened slightly at her words. "It's been quieter without you there." "A good quiet or a bad quiet?" Lillian asked, emboldened by something in his expression. "Definitely bad," he replied without hesitation. The simple honesty of his answer made Lillian's breath catch. Before she could respond, their food arrived, momentarily breaking the intensity of the moment. As they ate, Garrett asked about her plans for the school, listening intently as Lillian described her teaching philosophy and hopes for her students. His genuine interest touched her deeply. In Boston, the men of her acquaintance had always treated her educational ambitions as a charming but ultimately frivolous feminine fancy. "You're going to change lives here," Garrett said when she had finished speaking. These children have never had someone so dedicated to their learning before. I hope so, Lillian replied, moved by his faith in her abilities. It matters to me that they not only learn reading and arithmetic, but also how to think for themselves, to question and explore the world around them. After lunch, Garrett walked Lillian back to the schoolhouse. At the door, he paused, seeming to struggle with something he wanted to say. I'll be in town again next Friday, he said finally. Bringing supplies for the general store, perhaps we could have dinner. Lillian couldn't suppress her smile. I'd like that very much. Garrett's relief was visible. Until Friday, then. He tipped his hat and turned to go, but Lillian called after him. Garrett, he looked back, eyebrows raised in question. I'm glad the quiet is bad, she said simply. The slow smile that spread across his face stayed with Lillian long after he had ridden out of town. The next few weeks fell into a pattern. Lillian threw herself into teaching, delighted by her students' eagerness to learn despite their varying levels of education. Every Friday, Garrett would ride into Redemption with supplies or horses, and they would share a meal, sometimes at the hotel, other times a picnic by the small creek that ran near the edge of town. Each visit deepened their connection. Lillian learned about Garrett's childhood in Missouri, his difficult relationship with his father, his close bond with his mother who had died while he was away at war. Garrett, in turn, heard about Lillian's 3 older brothers, her passion for literature, her frustration with the limited options available to women in Eastern society. They discovered shared values, a belief in hard work, a love of learning, a desire for purpose over wealth and differences that complemented rather than divided them. Garrett's practical knowledge of the land and its ways balanced Lillian's more academic understanding of the world. As autumn approached, bringing cooler temperatures to the desert, Lillian found herself counting the days between Garrett's visits, her heart lifting at the first sight of him riding into town. The townspeople noticed, of course in a community as small as Redemption, little went unobserved, but their interest seemed largely approving. Mr. Wade's a good man, Mrs. Franklin remarked one evening as she helped Lillian prepare to move into her quarters at the schoolhouse. Keeps to himself mostly, but always fair in his dealings and generous when someone's in need. Did you know he trained a horse special for the Peterson boy after his accident, designed the saddle himself so the child could ride despite his crippled leg? Lillian hadn't known, but the story didn't surprise her. She had glimpsed Garrett's compassion from the moment he'd found her in the Sandstorm. Her new living quarters, though small, felt like a significant step toward independence. The space consisted of 2 rooms, a bedroom, and a combined kitchen and sitting area attached to the back of the schoolhouse. The town council had furnished it simply but adequately, and Lillian set about making it her own, arranging her books and the few personal items she had managed to salvage from her trunk after the stagecoach attack. On the Friday after she moved in, Garrett arrived with an unexpected gift, a small shelf he had crafted himself, designed to fit perfectly in the corner of her sitting room. For your books, he explained as he installed it. Noticed you had more than would fit on the existing shelves. The thoughtfulness of the gesture moved Lillian deeply. It's perfect, she said, running her fingers along the smooth wood. Thank you. That evening, instead of dining at the hotel, Lillian invited Garrett to eat at her new home. She had spent the afternoon preparing a simple but hearty stew, nervous about cooking for him but determined to create a more private setting for their time together. Seated across from each other at her small table, the intimacy of the moment wasn't lost on either of them. This was different from their meals at his cabin where she had been a guest in his space. Here she was welcoming him into her home as, what, a suitor? The word seemed both thrilling and inadequate. I've been thinking, Garrett said as they lingered over coffee after the meal. The ride between my place and Redemption takes time away from work I need to be doing with the horses. Lillian's heart sank. Was he saying his visits would become less frequent? But, he continued, seemingly unaware of her sudden distress, there's good grazing land about a mile outside of town, currently unused. Mayor Franklin mentioned it might be available for lease at a reasonable price. Hope flared in Lillian's chest. "You're considering moving your operation closer to redemption." Garrett met her eyes directly. "I'm considering moving closer to you." The simple honesty of his statement took Lillian's breath away. Neither of them had spoken openly of their feelings before, though they had grown increasingly obvious with each passing week. "Garrett," she began, then found herself at a loss for words. He reached across the table and took her hand in his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "I know this is forward of me. We haven't known each other long, not by Eastern standards anyway, but out here time moves differently." His blue eyes held her steadily. "I care for you, Lillian, more than I thought possible after everything, after the war." Lillian turned her hand in his, intertwining their fingers. "I care for you too," she whispered. Garrett's expression softened, relief and joy mingling in his gaze. "Then I'll speak to Franklin tomorrow about that land." Later, as they stood at her door preparing to say goodnight, Garrett hesitated, then slowly leaned down. His lips met hers in a kiss so gentle it nearly brought tears to Lillian's eyes, a promise, a beginning, a commitment to whatever might grow between them. As winter settled over the Arizona territory, Garrett's plan took shape. He leased the land outside Redemption and began constructing a modest house and stables on the property. Every weekend, he would ride to town, split his time between working on the new place and visiting Lillian, and return to his distant cabin during the week to care for his horses. The town watched their courtship with approving interest. Garrett began attending Sunday services at the small church where Lillian sang in the choir and joined community gatherings he had previously avoided. Slowly, the solitary horseman was becoming part of the fabric of redemption. For Lillian, these months were among the happiest of her life. Her school flourished, with enrollment growing as word spread of the dedicated teacher who could coax even the most reluctant student into a love of learning. And every Friday, her heart would leap at the sight of Garrett riding into town, his smile reserved solely for her. By early spring, Garrett's new home was nearly complete, and plans were made to move his horses from the distant cabin to their new pasture outside Redemption. The night before the move, Garrett invited Lillian to see the finished house. Riding double on Valor, Lillian now comfortable on horseback, after months of Garrett's patient teaching, they approached the neat wooden structure situated on a small rise overlooking a stream. The house was larger than his cabin had been, with a covered porch wrapping around two sides and corrals extending behind it. "It's wonderful, Garrett," Lillian said as he helped her dismount. "You've created something truly special here. Want to see inside?" He asked, a hint of nervousness in his voice that Lillian found endearing. The interior was simple but thoughtfully designed, with large windows to capture light and views of the surrounding landscape. A stone fireplace dominated the main room, reminding Lillian of the cabin where she had first come to know him. The furniture was a mix of pieces Garrett had built himself and items purchased from a craftsman in a neighboring town. "This is the kitchen," Garrett said, leading her into a bright room equipped with a new cast-iron stove. "And through here," he opened a door to reveal a bedroom with a large window facing east. "For the morning light," he explained. As Lillian moved to examine the view, she noticed something on the bedside table that made her breath catch. A small wooden box, intricately carved, identical to the one she had seen in his cabin months ago. Garrett followed her gaze and took a deep breath. "I've been carrying that box since the war," he said quietly. "It belonged to my mother. She gave it to me before I left, told me to keep something precious inside." He moved to the table and picked up the box, his expression solemn. "For years, it was empty. I had nothing precious enough to place in it." His eyes met Lillian's. "Until now." Slowly, he opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, lay a ring, a simple gold band set with a small but perfect diamond. "Lillian Montgomery," Garrett said, his voice steady despite the emotion clear in his eyes. "From the moment I found you in that sandstorm, you've been bringing light into my life. I built this house hoping it might someday be our home, not just mine." He took the ring from its box. "Will you marry me?" Tears blurred Lillian's vision as joy surged through her. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes, Garrett, yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms, his kiss conveying all the love and promise their future held. They were married 2 weeks later in Redemption's small church, the entire town turning out to witness the union of their beloved schoolteacher and the horseman who had rescued her from the desert. Mrs. Franklin had organized flowers for the altar, and Mayor Franklin proudly escorted Lillian down the aisle in the absence of her father. Garrett waited at the altar, more handsome than Lillian had ever seen him in a new black suit, his usually unruly hair neatly combed. When she reached him, the look in his eyes, wonder, love, gratitude, nearly overwhelmed her. "Dearly beloved," began the preacher, but Lillian barely heard the words that followed. All she could focus on was Garrett's hand holding hers, just as it had that day in the sandstorm, strong and steady, leading her to safety. Their vows were simple but heartfelt. Garrett's voice remained unwavering as he promised to love, honor, and cherish her for all his days. Lillian's own voice trembled slightly with emotion as she made the same promises in return. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the preacher finally announced. "Mr. Wade, you may kiss your bride." Garrett's kiss was gentle yet filled with promise, and the small church erupted in cheers and applause. The celebration that followed at the hotel was the largest Redemption had seen in years. The town's ladies had outdone themselves with food and decorations, and someone had even arranged for a fiddler from a neighboring settlement to provide music for dancing. As evening fell and lanterns were lit around the hotel's dining room, Garrett led Lillian onto the improvised dance floor for their first dance as husband and wife. "Happy, Mrs. Wade?" he asked softly as they moved to the music. "Completely," Lillian replied, her arms around his neck, the simple gold band on her finger catching the lamplight. "Though I still can't quite believe how much my life has changed since that stagecoach set out from Tucson." "For the better, I hope," Garrett said, his arms tightening slightly around her waist. "Beyond anything I could have imagined." She looked up into the blue eyes that had been her first sight of hope in the sandstorm. "Even getting lost in the desert was worth it to have found you." Later that night, after the last guests had departed and Garrett had driven their wagon to their new home, he lifted Lillian into his arms to carry her across the threshold. The house was illuminated by the soft glow of oil lamps he had lit earlier, welcoming them home. In their bedroom, nervousness mingled with anticipation as Garrett helped Lillian with the buttons of her wedding dress, his fingers gentle against her skin. Their coming together as husband and wife was tender and passionate, a culmination of the love that had grown between them from those first days at his cabin. Afterward, as they lay in each other's arms, Lillian rested her head on Garrett's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I've been thinking," she said softly. Garrett's fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "About fate or providence or whatever name you want to give it." Lillian propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. "If that stagecoach hadn't been attacked, if I hadn't gotten lost in the desert, if you hadn't decided to investigate those buzzards, we might never have met," Garrett finished for her. "Exactly. So many things had to go wrong for something so right to happen." Garrett brushed a strand of hair from her face, his expression thoughtful. "My mother used to say that God works in mysterious ways. Maybe sometimes the path that seems most difficult is actually leading us exactly where we need to be." Lillian smiled, settling back against his chest. "Well, I'm certainly grateful for wherever this path leads, as long as we're on it together." Spring blossomed into summer, and Lillian and Garrett settled into married life with a happiness that sometimes felt almost too perfect to be real. Each morning, Lillian would wake to find Garrett already up, tending to the horses before breakfast. They would share the morning meal, then part for their respective work, Lillian to the schoolhouse in town, Garrett to his growing horse breeding operation. In the evenings, they would reunite, sharing the events of their day over dinner before settling on the porch to watch the sunset paint the desert in spectacular colors. These simple rhythms of life together brought a contentment neither had dared hope for before finding each other. Garrett's business began to flourish as word spread of his skill with horses. A military officer from Fort Huachuca visited and placed an order for 10 mounts, praising the quality of Garrett's stock. Ranchers from as far as Tucson sought his expertise in training difficult horses, and a wealthy mine owner commissioned a matched pair of carriage horses for his wife. Lillian continued teaching, but also found ways to support Garrett's work. She kept the business ledgers, wrote advertisements for newspapers in larger towns, and composed eloquent letters to potential clients that showcased both Garrett's knowledge and his integrity. "We make a good team, you and I," Garrett observed one evening as they sat at the kitchen table, Lillian drafting a response to an inquiry from a California rancher. "We do," she agreed, smiling up at him. "Your practical skills and my way with words together were unstoppable." As autumn approached again, bringing the anniversary of their first meeting, Lillian began to suspect a new blessing was on its way. When her monthly cycle failed to appear for the second time, she consulted with Mrs. Franklin, who had served as midwife to most of Redemption's mothers. The older woman confirmed what Lillian had begun to hope: a baby would join their family by spring. That evening, when Garrett returned from delivering a horse to a nearby ranch, Lillian met him on the porch, her heart full of nervous excitement. "You look like you're about to burst with something," Garrett said, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. "What is it?" Lillian took both his hands in hers. "Garrett, we're going to have a baby." His expression transformed from confusion to wonder in an instant. "A baby, you're certain?" When she nodded, Garrett let out a whoop of joy that startled the horses in the nearby corral. He lifted Lillian off her feet, spinning her around before quickly setting her down again, suddenly concerned. "Should I not do that? I don't want to hurt you or the baby." Lillian laughed, touched by his immediate protectiveness. "I'm not made of glass, Garrett. I'm perfectly fine." That night, as they lay in bed, Garrett's hand rested gently on Lillian's still flat stomach, a gesture that would become familiar in the months ahead. "Boy or girl doesn't matter to me," he said softly, "just healthy and happy. And hopefully with your eyes," Lillian added, reaching up to touch his face. "I've loved your eyes since the first moment I saw them through that sandstorm." As Lillian's pregnancy progressed, Garrett's protective instincts grew increasingly evident. He insisted on driving her to and from the schoolhouse each day, concerned about her walking the mile into town. He built a cradle of polished pine for the baby's room, carving intricate designs of horses along the sides. He even began constructing a small rocking horse, planning ahead for when their child would be old enough to appreciate it. The town shared in their joy, with the women organizing a quilting bee to create a blanket for the baby, and the men helping Garrett add a nursery to their home. Mrs. Franklin appointed herself Lillian's unofficial guardian, ensuring she ate properly and rested enough despite her determination to continue teaching until close to her due date. As winter settled over the territory, bringing cooler temperatures and occasional rain, Lillian found herself reflecting often on the twists of fate that had brought her to this life. One evening, as she and Garrett sat before the fire, she voiced these thoughts. "Sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if I'd never answered that advertisement for a teacher," she said, her hands resting on her now prominent belly. "I'd probably be married to some businessman in Boston, hosting dinner parties and attending charity functions." Garrett's hand covered hers. "Would you have been happy?" "I don't think so," Lillian replied honestly. "Comfortable, perhaps, but not truly happy, not like this." "And what about now?" Garrett asked, his eyes searching hers. "Any regrets about choosing this life instead?" "It's not always easy out here." Lillian leaned forward to kiss him softly. "Not a single one. This is exactly where I'm meant to be." The baby arrived on a clear April morning, after a night of labor during which Garrett had paced anxiously outside the bedroom while Mrs. Franklin attended Lillian. When the older woman finally called him in, Garrett found Lillian propped up against pillows, tired but radiant, a small bundle cradled in her arms. "Come meet your daughter," Lillian said, her voice filled with wonder. Garrett approached almost reverently, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed. Lillian shifted the blanket to reveal a tiny face with a dusting of dark hair. She's perfect, he whispered, gently touching the baby's cheek with one finger. Just like her mother. They named her Grace for the blessings she represented in their lives. She had Garrett's blue eyes and what promised to be Lillian's delicate features, a perfect blend of both her parents. The years that followed brought both challenges and joys. Garrett's horse business continued to grow, eventually requiring him to hire 2 young men from town to help with the training and care of the animals. Lillian returned to teaching part-time once Grace was weaned, bringing the baby with her to the schoolhouse, where the older students delighted in taking turns holding her during their breaks. When Grace was 2, a son joined their family, Samuel, named after Garrett's father. Unlike his sister's easy birth, Samuel's arrival was difficult, with complications that left the doctor concerned for Lillian's health. After a week of anxious vigil, during which Garrett barely left her side, Lillian finally turned the corner toward recovery, though the doctor warned that future pregnancies might be dangerous. 2 perfect children is more than enough blessing for one lifetime, Garrett assured her when she expressed sorrow at the thought of not having more. I nearly lost you, Lillian. I won't risk that again. As the children grew, so did redemption. The railroad spur line that had been merely talk when Lillian first arrived became reality, bringing increased trade and new settlers to the area. The school expanded to 2 rooms with the addition of a second teacher, a young woman from California, who reminded Lillian of herself 7 years earlier. Through it all, Garrett and Lillian's partnership remained the foundation of their lives. They weathered droughts that threatened the horse business, an outbreak of influenza that swept through the town claiming several lives, and the normal challenges of raising spirited children in a still wild territory. On the 10th anniversary of the day Garrett had found Lillian in the Sandstorm, they rode together to the site of his old cabin, now occasionally used as a line shack by cowboys from neighboring ranches. The children stayed with Mrs. Franklin, allowing Garrett and Lillian a rare day alone together. The cabin looked smaller than Lillian remembered, but otherwise unchanged: the same stone fireplace, the same narrow bed in the corner, the same view of the harsh yet beautiful landscape from the single window. Hard to believe it's been 10 years, Garrett said, his arm around Lillian's waist as they stood in the doorway. In some ways it feels like yesterday, Lillian replied, leaning into him. In others, like another lifetime entirely. They had brought a picnic lunch, which they spread on a blanket under the shade of a mesquite tree near the cabin. As they ate, Lillian noticed Garrett seemed preoccupied, his gaze frequently drifting to the distant horizon. Penny would be nearly 25 now if she were still with us, he said after a while, referring to the gentle mare who had died peacefully in her sleep 2 winters ago. She was the first horse I ever truly connected with, taught me most of what I know about understanding them. She was special, Lillian agreed, remembering the kind-eyed chestnut who had carried her to redemption that first day. Grace still talks about her sometimes. Garrett nodded, then reached into his pocket and withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper. I have something for you. For our anniversary. Curious, Lillian unwrapped the gift to find a small wooden carving of a horse, unmistakably Penny, captured in mid-stride, her head held high and proud. Garrett, it's beautiful, she breathed, running her fingers over the smooth wood. Did you make this? He nodded, a hint of shyness in his expression. Been working on it in the evenings after you and the children were asleep. Wanted it to be a surprise. It's perfect, Lillian said, leaning over to kiss him. Thank you. She brought us together in a way, Garrett said, his arm tightening around Lillian. Seemed fitting to remember her on this day. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert, Lillian rested her head against Garrett's shoulder, contentment washing over her. If someone had told me back in Boston that I would end up here married to a horse breeder in Arizona Territory, mother to 2 beautiful children, teaching in a frontier town, I would have thought them mad, she mused. Any regrets? Garrett asked, echoing the question he had asked years before. Lillian looked up at him, At the face, she had grown to love more deeply, with each passing year the lines at the corners of his eyes now more pronounced, a touch of silver at his temples, but those same startling blue eyes still looking at her with unwavering love. "Not a single one," she replied with absolute certainty. "Getting lost in that sandstorm was the best thing that ever happened to me because it led me to you." Garrett smiled, the same smile that had first warmed her heart in a dust-filled cabin a decade ago. "And finding you was the best thing that ever happened to me." As the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant hues of gold and crimson, they sat together, hand in hand. Two souls who had found each other against all odds in the vast wilderness of the Arizona Territory, a schoolteacher from Boston and the cowboy, who had led her out of a sandstorm and into a life more rich and fulfilling than either could have imagined.